When people think of the American Wild West, several ideas often spring to mind. Saloons, conflict between cowboys and Native Americans, a general sense of lawlessness, and people being tied up to railroads for some inexplicable reason. The prevailing idea is that the Wild West was, well, wild. But how true is this view? Just how wild was the Wild West? Just to clear up some dates, when most people are talking about the Wild West, they're mostly referencing the period between 1848, when the US gained these lands, up until the early 20th century. So we'll go through these common images of the Wild West one at a time. First of all, saloons were very common since everybody liked to drink. But a couple of misconceptions exist. One, most saloons had regular doors because the Old West was dusty, and also because you want to lock the door sometimes. Yes, they did serve booze, it was expensive, yes, there was gambling, it caused problems, and yes, there were prostitutes, but they weren't exactly ever present. So just how wild were these saloons? They weren't. Most of them were essentially workers' clubs, and it was more likely you'd hear about marks than see a mass brawl. But what about cowboys then? Do they match up to the common image that we have of them? Nope. Cowboys were ranchers and worked to keep cattle safe from predators and the occasional thief. Now, cowboys all over the American West did develop a culture of suspicion of outsiders and of loutish violence, which led to many people who stayed in small frontier towns being accosted by local ranch workers. Sometimes they would be robbed, sometimes they would be assaulted, and sometimes the locals acted up to play up to the stereotype. What stereotype? Well, along the East Coast, many people were fascinated with the rugged culture that had been developing, and so many journalists travelled to the frontier to provide stories which they promptly exaggerated. And something not often spoken about is the fact that cowboys had bosses, and those bosses weren't too keen on the whole violence thing. Hence why when cowboys were caught misbehaving, they were fired. As for the cowboys and Indians trope, Native Americans were treated horrendously by those moving westward. However, most of the violence towards them wasn't between natives and roaming gangs of cowboys and bandits, it was between them and the central government, who could and did exert considerable force in the West. Which brings us onto law and order. There's a common idea of constant duels, robberies, and a general sense of lawlessness which was caused by there only being one sheriff every 100 square miles. Often, sheriffs would be aided by several others in their duties, and also being a sheriff was quite boring. When, say, looking at California during the gold rush, most crime was alcohol related, and there was very little in the way of serious violence, although criminal gangs did exist, especially in the South. However, the central government was able to exert pretty considerable control over the area despite the sheer empty distances. If crime got too bad, the central government or the state government could quickly clamp down on it because governors and politicians don't like to look bad and want to be re-elected. And as for the whole tying people to railroads thing, it originated as a trope of fiction in what were called dime novels, which were incredibly popular. And yes, this did actually happen to people, but one, it happened all over the US, not just in the West, and two, it happened about 5 times over a 50-year period. And so, to answer the question, how wild was the Wild West, the answer is, well, a little. Just as wild as the American East, or say rural Italy was at the time. The fact is, for most Americans living on the frontier, life was very similar to that back in the East. For every cowboy, there was a miner or a furniture maker, and a small mining town was often, all things considered, pretty boring.